In the first 3 parts of this series, I told the wonderful opening story of King Arthur, up to the point where he marries Guinevere, and together they set up the Knights of the Round Table. And then Arthur goes on to unite the kingdom for the first time. And we looked at how the myth is made up of 2 interwoven threads which symbolise our individual and collective lives. The King Arthur storyline, with the Round Table and its knights, is the collective thread, symbolising the wider community and culture in which our individual lives unfold. Now, in part 4, we turn to the story of the Grail Quest, which is the individual thread and symbolises our inner journey to wholeness. The oldest, and to me most resonant version of the Grail story is Chrétien de Troyes' 12th century tale called Percival, the Story of the Grail, in which a naive young man named Percival is the main character. And that is a version I mostly draw from. Incidentally, most of the images I'm using to illustrate this story come from my 15-part animated retelling of the Percival story, which I call Percival and the Grail. And for anyone who's interested, I'll put the link to that in the write-up. Percival has been brought up in Wales, which in the early Middle Ages denoted a very remote part of Britain. He has received no schooling and wears homespun clothes. In fact, Percival's mother has deliberately brought her son up in obscurity, far from civilisation and the glittering courtly world of knights, because she wants to keep him safe. And she has good reason for this, because Percival's 2 older brothers were killed in combat right after they became knights, and their deaths in turn caused their father, her husband, to die of grief. Unfortunately for her though, one day Percival is out in the forest practicing javelin throwing, his favourite pastime, when 5 knights come riding by. Percival is stunned by the apparition of these knights. He has no idea who or what they are, but the fineness of their appearance, their shiny armour, the blue and scarlet detailing on tunics and bridles dazzle him. In fact, at first, he takes them for angels and their leader for God, and he falls down and worships them. The knights think he has fainted from fear and explain that they are not angels, but knights. Percival tells them he has never seen a knight before and wants to know how he can become one. Taken aback at Percival's naivety, the knights humour him and explain that they were knighted by King Arthur, who is currently residing in his castle at Carlisle. Percival rushes home and announces to his mother that he intends to set off immediately for King Arthur's court to become a knight. She is horrified and starts telling him about the terrible fate of his brothers and father. Percival, however, by now is very hungry and isn't listening. So finally, reconciled to him leaving, his mother gives Percival some advice. He must always behave honourably towards ladies and help any maiden in distress. He should never kiss a maiden unless she consents and gives him her ring as a token of their understanding. And he should also be careful to ask the name of any man he meets along his way and make sure to keep the company of worthy men, because worthy men always give good advice. Lastly, she urges him to attend church whenever he can and pray that he will come to a good end. Percival asks what a church is, and she explains it is a beautiful house with holy relics and treasures, and also tells him about Lord Jesus and how he should pray to him. And, duly impressed for once, Percival promises he will. His mother weeps as her son sets off, and Percival looks back to see her fallen to the ground in a dead faint. But undeterred, he lashes his horse and rides on even faster into the world about which he knows nothing. He spends the night in the forest and, travelling on the next morning, comes upon a tent made of scarlet and gold cloth and topped by a gilded eagle, all shining in the sunlight. The tent is so beautiful, Percival thinks it must be one of the churches his mother told him about and goes inside to pray. But Instead of an altar, he finds a bed with a pretty young woman asleep in it. The girl wakes and on seeing Percival is terrified. Percival, misremembering his mother's advice, ignores her distress and her entreaties to leave before her lover returns and insists he must kiss her no matter whom it upsets because his mother told him to. He forces a clumsy embrace on her, kisses her, and, spotting her emerald ring, pulls it off. All the while the maiden wails and sobs that he's going to get her into trouble. But Percival is not listening because, once again, he is starving. He finds a small cask of wine and some venison pies and starts downing the wine and gorging himself on the pies, while assuring the poor girl that there's plenty for both of them and why doesn't she come and share them with him before finally taking his leave. And this begins a series of deranged interactions with other characters Percival meets, in which he shows himself to be not only naive, but headstrong, foolish, and gauche. Eventually, Percival comes upon the castle of Carlisle, perched on top of a cliff and overlooking the sea. And as he takes in the impressive view, he spies an armed knight riding out of the castle gates. In one hand, the knight holds his reins, lance, and shield, and in the other, he is holding a golden cup. But what catches Percival's attention the most is the bright scarlet colour of the knight's armour, and Percival vows to ask King Arthur for permission to conquer this knight and take his scarlet arms for himself. And with this goal in mind, Percival gallops on eagerly toward the castle. But when the Red Knight draws close, he stops Percival and asks where he is going in such a hurry. Percival, in his clueless but bold way, replies that he is headed to the court to ask for the right to take his red arms. Realising Percival is young and rash, the Red Knight doesn't take him seriously and instead orders Percival to tell Arthur that he, the Red Knight, is claiming ownership of Arthur's lands and that Arthur must send a champion to defend them. Finally, brandishing the gold cup, he boasts that it is Arthur's own cup, which he has just snatched up right under Arthur's nose. Characteristically though, Percival hasn't taken in any of this because he is already on his way. Percival rides right into the castle hall where the knights and King Arthur are at dinner. One of the noblemen, Yvonnet, approaches him and Percival demands to be shown which of the company is the king. Yvonnet politely points Arthur out and Percival walks his horse up close and tries to introduce himself. But Arthur is lost in thought and does not notice him. After trying a second time to get his attention, Percival exclaims, "How can this king make anyone a knight when you can't get a word out of him?" At this, Arthur comes out of his reverie, welcomes Percival and apologises for his distraction. But he explains he's been troubled by the threatening behaviour of his greatest enemy, the Red Knight from the forest of Conqueror, who not only just seized the king's golden cup, but spilt its contents over the queen. Guinevere was so enraged she has retired to her room in a suicidal mood. Percival, interested neither in Arthur's troubles nor his wife's outrage, says only, "Make me a knight, Sir King, because I want to be off." Arthur agrees, but tells Percival to first dismount and hand his hunter to a stable lad. But Percival refuses, because the knights he saw in the forest were mounted. "By my head, I'll never dismount," he exclaims. Furthermore, he demands the king grant him the arms of the Red Knight. One of his knights objects to Percival's behaviour, but Arthur takes a different view, saying although the lad is naive, he can still turn out a worthy vassal. So Percival gets his wish and is knighted by Arthur. And very soon after, he gets his second wish, when he meets up with the fearsome Red Knight, who is still hanging around outside the castle. Percival dashes towards him, shouting at him to take off his armour as ordered by King Arthur, to which the great red apparition replies, "Is anyone daring to come here, lad, to champion the king's right? If so, don't keep it to yourself." This inflames Percival, and he asks if the knight is making fun of him. The Red Knight simply repeats his question. Percival says if he doesn't take off his armour, he's going to hit him, whereupon the Red Knight finally loses his temper and gives Percival a great blow across the shoulders with the butt end of his lance. Percival slumps over on his horse, but, furious, sits right back up and, taking careful aim, throws his javelin and strikes the Red Knight dead. Percival sets about taking the armour off the dead body, but cannot work out how to do it. He is tugging in vain at the sword when Yvonne, who has followed him, comes up and begins to laugh at his hopeless efforts. Percival complains, "I'll have chopped the corpse into steaks before I can get any of the armour off. It sticks so tightly to the body." And once again, Yvonne comes to his aid and helps remove the armour. But then there is more comedy, when Percival will not hear of swapping his rough hemp shirt for the fine tunic of quilted silk which the Red Knight wore underneath his hauberk. Yvonne gives up trying to persuade Percival and instead helps him on with the armour. Percival hands his hunter to Yvonne, as he will now be riding the battle horse of the Red Knight. He also picks up the golden cup stolen from Arthur and asks Yvonne to return it to the king with his greetings. All of these scenes have elements of comedy and farce, from Percival and the Red Knight each underestimating the other, to Percival's refusal to dismount or to swap his homespun shirt for the fine silk tunic. Percival does not appear to measure up to the Knights of the Round Table. He is not noble. He does not act like a hero. In fact, he acts foolishly, and the journey he is on does not read like the hero's journey, but more like a farce. Why is this? The pattern of the hero's journey was first described by mythologist Joseph Campbell in his renowned book Hero with a Thousand Faces, which compared the stories of ancient hero myths from around the world. The first stages of the hero's journey laid out in Joseph Campbell's book, it begins with the call to adventure, followed by coming to the threshold of adventure, and then crossing the threshold. And so, in fact, underlying the comedy of Percival's journey, the opening stages of the archetypal hero's journey can be clearly identified. The call to adventure is the appearance of the knights in the forest. The threshold of adventure is his arrival at Carlisle Castle and becoming a knight. And the crossing of the threshold is his victorious fight with the Red Knight. So Percival has answered the call, and he has crossed the threshold of his adventure. However, unlike the ancient Greek hero Perseus, who flies off to behead the snake-haired Medusa, one glance at whom turns you to stone, and returns with the dreadful head hidden in his bag, or Jason, who sets off to find and bring back home the golden fleece, Percival has no idea that he is on a quest for the Grail, or for anything else. In fact, the Grail hasn't even been mentioned yet in the story. To me, both these features, the comedy and Percival's blissful ignorance of his quest, are intriguing, because I think they signify that this modern myth is updating what the hero's journey means for us now in our era. The psychic pattern still recurs, but the nature of the terrain is different. And we'll see, when we continue the story, that it can be interpreted as much as the stages of growing up and maturing, as it can a harrowing journey to face the monster in the labyrinth of our psyche. Equally, I think the Percival story counters the notion that the work of spiritual alignment is arduous and takes years of following a guru or a master, which has long been a tradition of spiritual thought, particularly rooted in the East. Instead, I believe the Grail myth describes both the process of working out our place in the world and the series of shifts and epiphanies whereby we come to access a new depth of self. These subtle epiphanies and adjustments are in the moment. They do not stretch out over time, but recur within time as we pay them attention. The blessing of a mentor, of a King Arthur, can act as a catalyst on our psyche. But as I already mentioned, in order to grow spiritually, we must go on the quest. We must leave Arthur's court, just as Percival does.